The wind carried the scent of damp earth and distant smoke across the village's edge, where fields gave way to a scatter of barns and rusting sheds. Evening light bent low through the crooked lines of willow branches, gilding the roofs in a tired, fading gold. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled in late summer after work was done, except for the sound that would not stop. A dog barked, sharp and ragged, over and over again. The animal was no stranger to the villagers. It belonged to an old carpenter named Bashir, a man whose hair had thinned to wisps, but whose hands were still strong enough to plane a stubborn plank. The dog, a wiry shepherd mix named Rafi, had grown up alongside his workshop, roaming fields by day and sleeping near the wood shavings at night. Loyal, but not given to noise. Yet this evening he planted himself before the carpenter's locked shed and hurled his voice against the silence, every bark echoing off the tin roof. Bashir, sitting on his porch with a half-drunk cup of tea, had tried to quiet him. He called the dog by name, even tossed a heel of bread into the yard, but Rafi would not turn his head. His whole body was fixed in one direction, ears forward, tail rigid, muscles quivering. The shed door, nailed shut after years of disuse, stood under the weight of his fury. Bashir's brow furrowed. He had locked that place long ago, left it to dust and spiders. There was nothing inside worth guarding, nothing alive. At least, that was what he believed. The neighbors began to notice. A woman, passing with a basket of laundry, paused at the gate. Two boys carrying fishing rods lingered by the road, whispering about the racket. By the time the sun had dipped to a red smear above the treetops, a small cluster of villagers had gathered, their faces lined with equal parts curiosity and unease. A dog that barked for a stranger was one thing. A dog that barked at a locked, familiar door, without pause, without reason, that unsettled them. Bashir rose at last, setting down his tea with a heavy clink. He walked stiffly toward the shed, his sandals grinding gravel, the crowd watching his every step. Rafi snapped his head to look at him for the briefest moment, then back to the door, whining now between barks. The sound was raw, pleading, as though he needed Bashir to understand what he himself could not. The carpenter placed a palm on the door. The wood was warm from the day's sun, but something about the touch made his stomach tighten. He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the metal hasp. Nothing, no sound, no movement. Only the dogs panting. For a moment he thought of turning back, of pulling Rafi away by the collar and restoring the calm. But his hand lingered. He had hammered these nails himself, sealed the latch himself, years ago after his tools had grown too few and his work too slow to fill the space. What could possibly stir a dog to madness here? Behind him, the murmurs of the crowd rose. Someone suggested calling the police. Another muttered about foxes or thieves hiding inside. The air seemed to thicken with suspicion, every theory darker than the last. Bashir shook his head, but he could feel the eyes pressing against him. His own unease was now public, magnified. At last, the crackle of a radio broke the standoff. Two officers arrived, one young, one older, their uniforms creased from long hours. They stepped out of their vehicle with measured calm, as though careful not to agitate the dog further. The younger officer crouched, studying Rafi's rigid form, while the elder approached Bashir with a nod. "Best to open it," the officer said quietly, his tone carrying neither accusation nor reassurance. Bashir hesitated. His chest tightened in a way that surprised him, as if the shed contained not forgotten tools, but a chapter he had chosen never to revisit. He reached for the keys he had not touched in years, their weight suddenly strange in his pocket. The dog barked again, higher, urgent, his claws scraping against the old wood as though the door itself were resisting some truth. The crowd fell silent, waiting. The officers shifted their weight, one hand brushing the handle of a flashlight, the other resting near his belt. Bashir slid the key into the rusted lock. The metal groaned, reluctant. Rafi's bark cracked into a low, guttural growl. His body pressed so close to the gap beneath the door it seemed he might tear through the wood himself. As the key turned, Bashir caught himself holding his breath. For an instant he wished he had ignored the barking, wished the dog had never chosen this door. The world seemed to narrow to the sound of the tumblers aligning, the smell of dry timber, the press of waiting eyes. The lock gave way with a dull snap, and Bashir froze, his hand trembling on the latch. Behind him, the murmurs hushed into complete silence. Rafi whined, pawing frantically at the threshold, as if he sensed that the moment before the door opened would matter more than whatever came after, and in that pause, as dusk swallowed the last light from the fields, Bashir understood something he could not name, but could feel deep in his bones. Whatever lay inside was not forgotten, not harmless, and not meant to remain unseen. The hinges gave way with a rasping sigh as Bashir pulled the door open. The smell struck first, damp wood, rust, and something sharper like iron left too long in rain. The crowd leaned forward but said nothing. Inside, the gloom swallowed detail. Dust spiraled in the shaft of light from the doorway, drifting like ash. Rafi forced his way past Bashir, claws clattering on the stone floor, nose pressed low, then high, frantic in his search. The older officer lifted his flashlight and swept the beam across forgotten planks. Cracked jars, a bicycle frame collapsed against the wall. The light found movement, quick, shivering. A shape huddled in the corner, no larger than a child, shoulders drawn tight, hair matted. The sound that followed was not animal, but a rasp of breath, shallow and raw, dragging itself against silence. Gasps broke from the doorway. Bashir's knees weakened, his hand catching the frame to steady himself. He had expected rats or nothing at all, but not this. The boy, if it was a boy, turned his face away from the light, eyes closing against the brightness as though it burned. Rafi crept closer, his growl dissolving into a whine. His tail lowered, not in fear but in recognition. The dog stopped a few feet away, lowering himself to the floor, chest pressed to stone, nose stretching forward. The boy flinched, curling tighter. The officer moved to step inside, but the younger one touched his arm, a pause heavy with caution. The shed seemed to shrink around them, the air thick, carrying both the stench of mildew and the fragile weight of a secret too long hidden. The villagers, silent now, shifted uneasily, their shadows long across the yard as twilight deepened. Bashir's hands trembled. Memories tugged at him, faces blurred by years. The echo of a child's laughter once threaded through these fields. He shook his head as though to dislodge it, but the boy's shape, crouched and trembling, rooted him to the ground. The older officer crouched, his voice low though the words carried. "It's all right." But the boy pressed his back to the wall, bare feet scraping, nails scratching against the stone as though escape meant burrowing through it. And then came a sound none had expected, a low rumble from Rafi, not warning, not anger. It was a coaxing sound, deep in the chest, the kind a mother makes to still a restless pup. The dog edged forward another inch, then another, his body stretched long, head bowed. The boy's breathing slowed, his eyes flickering toward the animal's stillness. A drizzle began, so fine it could have been mistaken for mist. Soft against the tin roof, then stronger, pattering like 1,000 small knocks. The villagers drew their shawls tighter, but no one left. The rain seemed a veil, muting everything except the fragile tension in the shed. The boy lifted his face at last. Dirt streaked his cheeks, but beneath it his eyes glimmered with a startling clarity, searching not the officers or the villagers, but Bashir. The carpenter stiffened, his chest hollowing, because the look was not of a stranger's fear. It was recognition. The officer straightened. "We'll need to—" But Bashir's hand rose sharply, stopping him. Something unspoken passed in that gesture, a refusal to let this moment belong to procedure. The boy shifted, one foot pressing against the floor as though readying to move, not toward the officers but toward Bashir himself. The drizzle turned to rain, harder now, beating the tin so loud it seemed to smother words. Bashir stepped across the threshold into the shed. The dog did not move. He simply wagged his tail once, slow, deliberate, as if to mark the decision already made. In that instant, a shift occurred, no longer a question of what was hidden, but of why, and who among them would carry its weight. The latch gave way, and the shed door creaked open with a reluctant shudder. The smell hit first, damp wood, old dust, and something sharper beneath it, metallic and sour, like rust that had not seen the air in years. Rafi lunged forward, pressing his nose into the widening gap, his growls breaking into short, frantic whines. The officers tightened their stance, one lifting his flashlight though the beam had yet to pierce the darkness inside. Bashir's hand fell back to his side. He did not step in, though the space was his. The years he had ignored this place seemed suddenly to weigh on him, as if his absence had allowed it to become something else entirely. The dog barked once more, then fell into silence, his ears pricked and body trembling. The shift from noise to stillness was more unsettling than the barking had ever been. The younger officer finally pushed the door wider. Dust drifted in pale ribbons through the fading light. At first, there was nothing but the outline of stacked planks and old tools, their edges dulled by time. Then the beam of the flashlight caught movement, a quiver in the shadows, low to the ground. Something shifted against the far wall. The crowd outside drew closer, their feet crunching the gravel in unison. The air felt heavier. The late summer breeze stilled as if even the willows bent back to watch. Rafi growled again, deeper this time, not in warning but in recognition. His body angled sideways, tail stiff, the way dogs do when they try to block rather than attack. A sound emerged from the corner. Not a growl, not the hiss of an intruder, but a faint rhythmic rasp. Breath. Shallow, labored, as though pulled from lungs that had nearly given up. The flashlight swept again, and the beam landed on a pair of eyes reflecting back with a wet glint. Not wild eyes. Not animal. Human. Gasps rippled through the villagers. Bashir's jaw slackened, but he said nothing. The figure crouched in the corner, knees drawn tight, face half hidden beneath matted hair. The wrists were bruised with old marks and a torn sleeve hung loose over one thin arm. For a moment the officers did not move, as if afraid their own presence might fracture the fragile shape before them. Then came the smallest movement, a hand, trembling, lifting just enough to shield the eyes from the light. The gesture was ordinary, almost delicate, but in the silence it carried the weight of years. Rafi let out a soft whine and lowered himself onto his belly, nose pressed flat to the ground as though to show no threat. The younger officer stepped forward, his boots stirring dust, but Bashir raised a hand without thinking, halting him. His breath rattled, his chest heavy. Whatever this was, it was not theft, not trespass. It was something older, something he could not yet name but felt pressing against the edges of memory. From outside, someone called out a question, but no answer came. The villagers could only see the shapes. The dogs sprawled low, the officers poised, and Bashir standing as if carved from the same wood as the shed itself. The figure in the corner drew in another ragged breath, and in the beam of light a glint of something metallic flashed near the ground. A chain, no thicker than a rope, looped against the ankle. The sight shifted the air entirely. What had seemed like confusion hardened into dread. Rafi barked again, a single sharp crack, and the figure flinched but did not flee. The sound rang through the shed like a signal, sharp enough to silence even the murmurs outside. Bashir's hand clenched at his side. The decision was his now, whether to step forward or turn away, to claim what was bound within his forgotten shed, or to let others move first. The door hung open, and the world pressed in, waiting. The hinges released with a rasp, and the door cracked open into a breath of cool, stale air. Rafi lunged forward, nose pressing hard to the gap, his whole body trembling as though drawn by something invisible. The officers steadied themselves, one flicking his flashlight beam into the darkness. Dust motes swirled in the sudden slice of light, catching on abandoned shapes, broken crates, coils of rope, rusted saws leaning in forgotten corners. Nothing moved. Yet the dog refused to quiet. His hackles bristled, his paws scraped, his chest pressed low as if he were preparing to crawl into the shadow itself. The elder officer stepped inside first, his boots sounding against the warped planks. He swept the beam along the walls, across shelves sagging with jars of bent nails and hinges dulled by time. The villagers craned closer at the threshold, drawn by the silence between barks. And then the light steadied. The beam narrowed on a shape in the far corner, something that did not belong among tools and timber. A cage. It was iron, corroded yet intact, its bars thick enough to hold more than vermin. Inside, straw lay pressed flat, matted with patches of fur. A shallow bowl, long dry, clung to the floor. The smell rose slowly, metallic and sharp, as though time itself had sealed it until this moment. Rafi's growl deepened. He pressed so hard against the doorframe that the wood groaned. Bashir's knees seemed to weaken, his breath unsteady. The younger officer glanced at him but said nothing. There was no accusation, only the weight of the discovery itself. The villagers whispered, their words fragments. Animals. Kept. Who? Until the elder raised a hand for quiet. The officer bent lower, pushing his light deeper into the cage. Scratches marred the inside of the bars, deep grooves that spoke of desperation. They were too large for a rat, too ragged for a bird. Something had once fought here. Something had once tried to escape. A drizzle began outside, faint at first, then steady, tapping on the tin roof. Its rhythm bled into the silence, as though the sky itself had taken note of what was found. The villagers shifted uneasily, some drawing their shawls tighter, others stepping back from the shed's mouth. Their faces were pale with a discomfort they could not yet name. Bashir's hand rested on the frame, his fingers curled as though holding himself upright. He did not step forward, did not deny or explain. The rain's patter grew heavier, and in its sound, his silence deepened. The younger officer noticed something glinting near the bowl. He reached through the bars with his flashlight's end, nudging it closer to the light. A tag, metal, thin, stamped with numbers that caught the beam. He turned it over slowly, lips tightening as he read. He slipped it into his pocket without a word, but the gesture did not escape the villagers. Suspicion shifted to unease to fear. Raffi barked once more, but the sound was different now. Less fury, more insistence. He turned in a quick circle, whining, then faced the open yard as though demanding the humans follow. His claws clicked against the wet stones, his eyes bright with something beyond simple alarm. The elder officer straightened, his expression unreadable. He motioned for the cage to remain untouched, then closed his palm over the dangling lock still warm from Bashir's key. "Leave it," he said quietly, though his voice carried through the rain. The crowd stirred, uncertain whether to scatter or stay. A choice hung in the air like the clouds pressing low over the village. Bashir lowered his gaze, his shoulders heavy under the weight of words unsaid. Raffi pawed at the ground, pulling forward again, nose lifted to the drizzle, leading not toward the cage but away from it, toward the deeper fields, as if the story stretched further than these walls. No one followed, not yet, but the direction of his pull, the unbroken urgency in his eyes, left a mark on every witness. Whatever had been caged here was not the end of the matter. It was only the first opening. The rain eased into a soft mist by morning, draping the village in a silence that felt heavier than the night before. The shed remained open, its swollen door leaning against the wall like a broken arm. Raffi lay stretched in the damp grass, no longer barking, no longer pressing against the threshold. He kept his eyes fixed on the fields beyond the road, as if some part of him still waited for what no one else could see. The officers had not returned. Their vehicle had disappeared before dawn, taking the metal tag and its unspoken meaning with them. The villagers scattered soon after, unwilling to linger where questions outweighed answers. Only Bashir remained, seated on a low stool near the shed, his clothes darkened by the drizzle. He did not touch the cage. He did not touch the tools around it. He sat with his hands folded, his gaze low, as though the earth itself held a truth he was no longer able to bury. Raffi stirred when the old man finally rose. The carpenter moved slowly, his joints stiff, his body weighted with years and something heavier than years. He crossed to the cage and crouched. His fingers brushed the rusted bars, tracing the deep scratches carved into their surface. He did not flinch. He only nodded, once, as if acknowledging the presence of a memory long denied. The truth had not been spoken aloud, but it did not need to be. The marks on the iron, the dry bowl, the numbers on the tag, they spoke of an animal once confined, not for cruelty but for use. The villagers had long whispered about programs that came through the countryside decades ago, men who sought strays and captured them for training, dogs made to serve, to patrol, to guard. Bashir had been younger then, strong enough to build, strong enough to obey without asking. Raffi's barking had not uncovered a secret as much as it had uncovered the echo of one, a life withheld, a loyalty exploited, and a silence that had stretched too far. Bashir straightened with effort, his hand steadying against the frame. He glanced at Raffi, who met his eyes without moving. The dog's ears flicked, then settled. Between them lay no accusation, only recognition. The bond of animal and man had always been there, but now it bore the weight of history neither had chosen. Without a word, Bashir crossed to the edge of the field. He left the cage open behind him, its bars shining faintly in the pale light, not with menace but with surrender. The rain had washed the floor clean, carrying straw and dust into small rivulets that slipped beneath the door. Nothing living would return to that space again. Rafi followed, trotting lightly beside him, no longer urgent, no longer frantic. His body moved with a looseness that had not been there the day before, as though the release of the shed had loosened something within him too. He did not look back. He did not need to. They walked past the last cottages, where smoke curled in thin threads from chimneys and the air smelled of wet soil. The fields spread wide and soft with dew, their grasses bending under the morning light. Bashir paused at the boundary stone, his palm resting on the cool surface. He looked out at the open land, his breath visible in the chill air. Rafi stepped ahead, nose to the ground, tail lifted in quiet curiosity. For the first time in years, Bashir did not call him back. He let the dog wander a few paces, free of fences and locked doors, unbound by fear or memory. In the distance, the mist moved across the fields like a slow, unrolling tide, swallowing the horizon. The old man lowered himself to sit by the stone, his back against its worn edge. He closed his eyes and listened, to the faint rustle of the grass, to the soft patter of drops falling from willow branches, to the steady sound of paws moving through wet earth. He did not feel absolution, but he felt something quieter, something closer to release. Rafi paused once at the crest of a low hill. He turned his head, ears pricked, body silhouetted against the pale drift of fog. His gaze lingered for a heartbeat before he disappeared into the whiteness, leaving only the trace of movement where grass bowed and rose again. The shed behind the village stood silent. Its door swung gently in the damp air, the lock hanging loose, the cage within already beginning to rust back into earth. By noon, even the villagers ceased to speak of it, their lives turning back to the rhythm of work and weather. Yet the image of the dog at the door remained, a reminder that silence does not erase what has been carried, and that sometimes the most insistent voice comes not from words, but from loyalty that refuses to fade. The wind shifted, scattering the mist, lifting small fragments of straw from the shed's threshold and sending them across the field until they vanished into the distance. The earth swallowed them, as it always did, leaving no sign but the memory of their weight.